Hi guys, tonight we're exploring perhaps the most devastating scenario imaginable. What if every piece of human knowledge suddenly vanished from every mind on Earth? Not our memories of loved ones or basic motor skills, but all accumulated learning, expertise, and information. If you enjoy these knowledge apocalypse sleep stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And drop a comment letting me know what time it is, where you are, and where you're listening from. I appreciate connecting with thoughtful viewers across the globe. All right, let's begin. The morning sun rises over Manhattan just as it has for countless millennia, casting long shadows between the towering glass and steel monuments to human achievement. But something profound has changed in the darkness of night. In the gleaming offices of Goldman Sachs, a trader stares blankly at a computer screen filled with numbers that might as well be hieroglyphics. The symbols on her keyboard look familiar, yet their meaning has vanished like smoke. Across the East River, a surgeon at Mount Sinai Hospital holds a scalpel with the same steady hands that have performed thousands of operations. But the knowledge of where to make the first incision has simply evaporated from his mind. This is not amnesia in the traditional sense. Every human being on Earth still remembers their name, recognizes their family, and recalls the emotional tapestry of their personal experiences. The trader remembers her first kiss, her wedding day, the birth of her children. The surgeon can still feel the pride he felt graduating medical school, and the weight of responsibility he carries for his patients. But the vast cathedral of human knowledge, built over 10,000 years of civilization, has crumbled to dust in a single night. Every equation, every historical fact, every technical manual, every piece of learned skill beyond the most basic instincts has been wiped clean from 7.8 billion minds simultaneously. Within the first hour, the scope of this catastrophe begins to reveal itself in ways both mundane and terrifying. At John F. Kennedy International Airport, air traffic controllers stare at radar screens showing 237 aircraft in various phases of approach and departure, but the intricate choreography of flight paths and communication protocols has become an indecipherable mystery. Captain Sarah Martinez, with 14,000 flight hours logged in her Boeing 777, finds herself unable to remember the meaning of the altitude readings on her instrument panel. She knows the buttons and switches feel familiar, but their functions have become as foreign as ancient Sanskrit. The immediate human toll is catastrophic. Within 6 hours, approximately 4,000 commercial flights worldwide have either crashed or made emergency landings in fields, highways, and anywhere pilots could find flat ground through sheer instinct. The death toll from aviation accidents alone reaches nearly 1 million people as massive aircraft, carrying an average of 250 passengers each, fall from the sky like metallic rain. The economic impact is measured not just in the $17.4 billion worth of destroyed aircraft, but in the complete paralysis of global transportation networks that move 4.5 billion passengers annually and generate over $800 billion in revenue. But aviation represents merely the first domino in a chain reaction of civilizational collapse. At nuclear power plants across the globe, technicians who once understood the delicate balance of uranium fission reactions now stare helplessly at control panels. The Diablo Canyon power plant in California, which generates 9% of the state's electricity through its 2 reactors containing approximately 100 tons of enriched uranium, begins experiencing the first signs of system failure. Without human intervention to maintain the precise choreography of control rod positions, coolant flow rates, and pressure regulation, the plant's automatic safety systems engage. But even these mechanical safeguards were designed assuming human oversight. Dr. James Chen, who yesterday could have explained the intricacies of neutron absorption cross-sections and thermal efficiency calculations, now finds himself as helpless as a child in a control room filled with blinking lights and incomprehensible readouts. The knowledge that radioactive decay continues at a predictable rate, that coolant systems require constant monitoring, that containment protocols must be followed to prevent catastrophic release of radiation, has simply vanished. Across the world, 442 nuclear reactors face similar scenarios as their operators struggle with technology they can no longer comprehend. The cascading failure of electrical grids follows within hours. The North American power grid, a marvel of engineering that delivers electricity across a network spanning over 200,000 miles of high-voltage transmission lines, begins to destabilize as power plants shut down or operate erratically. The knowledge of load balancing, frequency regulation, and grid interconnection protocols has disappeared along with everything else. Transformers that step down 765 kilovolt transmission lines to the 120 volts that power homes become mysterious metal boxes whose purpose operators can no longer fathom. By the end of the first day, roughly 60% of North America experiences rolling blackouts. The economic implications are staggering. Every hour without electricity costs the United States economy approximately $150 million in lost productivity, spoiled goods, and business interruption. Multiply this across every industrialized nation simultaneously, and the daily economic loss reaches nearly $18 billion. But these numbers, vast as they are, pale in comparison to the human cost. In hospitals worldwide, the situation becomes apocalyptic. Dr. Amara Okafor at Lagos University Teaching Hospital, who performed her first surgery only 18 months ago, finds herself facing a patient with acute appendicitis, but no memory of anatomical structure, surgical procedures, or even basic medical knowledge. The operating theatre, with its array of instruments each designed for specific purposes, has become a chamber of mysterious tools. She remembers wanting to help people, remembers the satisfaction of healing, but the knowledge of how the human body functions, how diseases progress, how medications interact, has evaporated entirely. The pharmaceutical supply chain, dependent on precise knowledge of chemical compositions, manufacturing processes, and quality control procedures, collapses within days. The production of insulin, which keeps 8 million Americans with type 1 diabetes alive, requires an understanding of recombinant DNA technology, bacterial fermentation processes, and purification techniques that no longer exist in human memory. Each vial of insulin represents a complex manufacturing process involving genetically modified E. coli bacteria, specific temperature controls, and precisely timed chemical reactions. Without this knowledge, diabetic patients worldwide face a death sentence as existing supplies, totaling approximately 60 million vials globally, begin to dwindle. The implications extend far beyond individual medications. Cancer treatment protocols, which have evolved through decades of clinical trials involving millions of patients, have vanished. The knowledge that chemotherapy drugs like cisplatin and doxorubicin target rapidly dividing cells, that radiation therapy requires precise dosing calculations, that surgical oncology demands understanding of tumor biology and metastasis patterns, no longer exists. The 14 million people worldwide currently undergoing cancer treatment find themselves in medical systems that can no longer provide the complex, knowledge-intensive care their survival depends upon. Emergency medical services face similar paralysis. Paramedics arriving at accident scenes remember wanting to help but cannot recall the ABCs of trauma care: airway, breathing, circulation. The knowledge that severe blood loss requires immediate pressure application, that spinal injuries demand careful immobilization, that cardiac arrest requires specific drug protocols and defibrillation procedures has disappeared. Emergency rooms, normally bustling centres of medical knowledge and rapid decision-making, become overwhelmed chaos as medical professionals struggle to provide care based solely on instinct and basic human compassion. The collapse extends deep into infrastructure systems that modern civilization takes for granted. Water treatment facilities, which purify and deliver over 400 billion gallons of water daily across the United States alone, require sophisticated understanding of chemical processes, bacterial contamination, and filtration systems. The operators at the Croton Water Treatment Plant, which serves 9 million New York City residents, no longer understand that chlorine disinfection requires precise dosing, that pH levels must be maintained between 6.5 and 8.5, that turbidity measurements indicate filtration effectiveness. Without proper water treatment, waterborne diseases that have been virtually eliminated from developed nations begin to resurface. Cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery, diseases that kill over 1 million people annually in regions with poor water quality, spread rapidly through populations suddenly dependent on untreated water sources. The knowledge of boiling water for sterilization, building simple filtration systems, or recognizing contamination sources has vanished along with more advanced technical expertise. Food production systems, the foundation of civilization itself, face unprecedented collapse. Modern agriculture depends on intricate knowledge of soil chemistry, pest management, plant genetics, and machinery operation. A single John Deere combine harvester, capable of processing 300 tons of wheat per day during harvest season, becomes an incomprehensible maze of mechanical components to farmers who can no longer recall how internal combustion engines function or understand the principles of hydraulic systems. The global food supply chain, which moves over 4 billion tons of food annually across continents, grinds to a halt. Container ships carrying 20,000 40-foot containers of agricultural products sit motionless in ports, as longshoremen stare at massive cranes they can no longer operate. The knowledge of GPS navigation systems, cargo manifests, refrigeration requirements for perishables, and port logistics has evaporated. Each day of delay means millions of tons of produce rotting in transit, representing billions of dollars in lost food resources and impending famine for populations dependent on imported nutrition. Livestock management faces similar devastation. Cattle ranchers who once understood breeding programs, vaccination schedules, and nutritional requirements now face herds of animals they remember caring for, but no longer know how to maintain properly. The knowledge that cattle require specific mineral supplements, that breeding cycles follow predictable patterns, that disease prevention requires particular veterinary interventions has disappeared. The United States cattle population of 94 million head, representing over $70 billion in livestock value, faces potential decimation as caretakers struggle with basic animal husbandry. Financial systems, the circulatory system of modern economies, experience immediate cardiac arrest. Trading floors that once processed trillions of dollars in daily transactions become silent theatres of confusion. The New York Stock Exchange, which typically handles over $100 billion in daily trading volume, shuts down as traders and market makers find themselves unable to understand basic concepts of supply and demand, price discovery, or risk assessment. The knowledge of financial instruments, mathematical models for pricing derivatives, and economic principles that underpin market function has vanished entirely. Banking systems face similar paralysis. ATMs become mysterious boxes that occasionally dispense money, but bank employees no longer understand concepts of interest rates, loan underwriting, or monetary policy. The Federal Reserve System, which manages over $4 trillion in assets and influences global economic conditions through interest rate decisions and money supply management, finds itself staffed by people who remember working in finance but can no longer comprehend the mechanisms of monetary policy or economic stabilization. Credit markets, which facilitate over $15 trillion in annual lending globally, freeze completely. The knowledge of creditworthiness assessment, collateral evaluation, and risk pricing disappears overnight. Mortgage lending, which enables home ownership for over 65% of American families, becomes impossible as loan officers can no longer evaluate property values, employment stability, or debt-to-income ratios. The construction industry, dependent on both financing and technical knowledge, faces a double catastrophe as both funding and building expertise vanish simultaneously. Transportation networks beyond aviation face equally severe disruption. Railroad systems, which move over 40% of long-distance freight in the United States, depend on complex signaling systems, route optimization, and mechanical knowledge that has disappeared. Train engineers who once navigated 1,000-ton freight consists across thousands of miles of track now find themselves unable to interpret signal lights, understand air brake systems, or manage locomotive controls. The knowledge that air brake systems require specific pressure maintenance, that train dynamics involve complex physics of momentum and friction, that railroad signals follow standardized protocols for safety, no longer exists. Maritime shipping, which carries over 90% of global trade by volume, encounters similar obstacles. Container ships the size of floating cities, capable of carrying 24,000 20-foot equivalent units, become stranded as navigators lose understanding of celestial navigation, electronic chart systems, and port procedures. The Ever Given, which famously blocked the Suez Canal in 2021, represents the scale of vessels that require sophisticated knowledge to operate safely. Without understanding of ballast management, propulsion systems, and navigation protocols, these massive ships become floating hazards rather than commercial lifelines. Urban transportation systems collapse as subway operators lose comprehension of electrical systems, track switching mechanisms, and passenger safety protocols. The New York City subway system, which carries 5.5 million riders daily across 472 stations, shuts down as operators face control panels filled with switches and indicators whose functions have become mysterious. The knowledge of third rail electrical systems, signal progression, and crowd management disappears along with technical expertise, stranding millions of commuters and effectively paralyzing urban mobility. Communication systems experience rapid degradation as maintenance becomes impossible. Cellular networks, which connect over 5 billion mobile subscribers globally through a complex infrastructure of base stations, switching centers, and satellite links, begin failing as technicians lose understanding of radio frequency management, digital signal processing, and network routing protocols. The knowledge that cellular signals require specific power levels, that frequency allocation prevents interference, that network capacity depends on sophisticated traffic management has vanished from human memory. Internet infrastructure, the nervous system of modern civilization, faces similar decay. Data centers consuming over 200 billion kilowatt-hours annually and housing millions of servers become incomprehensible facilities to administrators who no longer understand server configuration, network protocols, or data backup procedures. The knowledge of TCP/IP networking, database management, cybersecurity protocols, and system administration disappears overnight, leaving the digital infrastructure that enables everything from online banking to social media gradually deteriorating without human intervention. The collapse of telecommunications has profound implications for emergency response and disaster coordination. Emergency call centres, which handle over 240 million 911 calls annually in the United States alone, find themselves unable to dispatch appropriate resources or coordinate multi-agency responses. The knowledge of emergency protocols, resource allocation, and communication procedures that enables effective disaster response has disappeared, leaving communities vulnerable to both natural disasters and man-made emergencies without coordinated assistance. Manufacturing industries face complete paralysis as workers lose understanding of production processes, quality control, and equipment operation. Automobile assembly lines, which produce over 95 million vehicles annually worldwide, shut down as workers find themselves surrounded by sophisticated machinery they can no longer comprehend. The knowledge of just-in-time manufacturing, robotics programming, and assembly sequence optimization disappears, halting production of vehicles, machinery, and consumer goods that modern society depends upon. Chemical manufacturing, which produces the raw materials for everything from plastics to pharmaceuticals, becomes extremely hazardous as operators lose understanding of reaction kinetics, safety protocols, and quality control procedures. The Dow Chemical Complex in Texas, which processes millions of tons of chemical feedstocks annually, faces potential catastrophic accidents as workers struggle with processes involving high temperatures, pressures, and toxic materials without understanding the underlying chemistry or safety requirements. Steel production, the foundation of construction and manufacturing, faces similar challenges. Blast furnaces operating at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit require precise understanding of metallurgy, chemical reactions, and thermal management. The knowledge of how iron ore, coke, and limestone interact to produce steel, how temperature and timing affect metal properties, and how to safely operate equipment handling molten metal at extreme temperatures has vanished from human consciousness. Educational systems, which would normally serve as repositories and transmission mechanisms for knowledge, find themselves empty vessels. Universities housing libraries with millions of volumes become buildings filled with incomprehensible texts. The Harvard University library system, containing over 17 million books and representing centuries of accumulated human knowledge, becomes meaningless to librarians and scholars who can no longer read or comprehend the information within those volumes. Teachers at every level, from elementary schools to graduate programs, find themselves facing students with knowledge they can no longer access or convey. The accumulated wisdom of pedagogical methods, curriculum development, and subject matter expertise disappears overnight. Mathematics teachers can no longer explain why 2 + 2 = 4. History professors cannot recall the causes of major wars or the rise and fall of civilizations, and science instructors find themselves unable to describe basic physical laws or biological processes. Research institutions which drive innovation and scientific advancement become paralyzed as researchers lose understanding of experimental methodology, statistical analysis, and theoretical frameworks. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN, representing over $4 billion in scientific investment and decades of international collaboration, becomes an incomprehensible machine to physicists who can no longer understand quantum mechanics, particle physics, or the fundamental forces of nature. Medical research comes to a complete halt as scientists lose understanding of clinical trial design, drug development processes, and regulatory requirements. The knowledge of how to test new medications safely, analyze efficacy data, and navigate approval processes disappears, halting progress on treatments for cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and countless other conditions that affect millions of patients worldwide. Agricultural research faces similar paralysis, with devastating long-term implications for food security. plant breeding programs that have developed drought-resistant crops, improved nutritional content, and increased yields through decades of careful selection and genetic understanding become impossible to continue. The knowledge of plant genetics, soil science, and ecosystem interactions that enable sustainable agriculture disappears, threatening humanities to feed itself as population grows and climate conditions change. Law enforcement agencies find themselves unable to investigate crimes or maintain public order as officers lose understanding of legal procedures, forensic techniques, and criminal investigation methods. Police departments equipped with sophisticated technology for crime scene analysis, ballistics testing, and DNA analysis find these tools incomprehensible to investigators who can no longer remember how evidence collection works or understand legal standards for prosecution. Court systems collapse as judges and lawyers lose comprehension of legal precedents, constitutional principles, and procedural requirements. The knowledge of how laws are interpreted, how evidence is evaluated, and how justice systems function disappears overnight. Prisons holding over 10 million inmates globally face management crises as administrators lose understanding of security protocols, rehabilitation programs, and legal requirements for incarceration. Military forces worldwide face unprecedented vulnerability as personnel lose understanding of weapon systems, tactical doctrine, and strategic planning. Modern military equipment, from advanced fighter jets to nuclear submarines, requires sophisticated technical knowledge and operational expertise that has vanished from human memory. The F-35 Lightning II fighter jet, representing over $400 billion in development costs and incorporating the most advanced aerospace technology, becomes useless metal to pilots who can no longer understand avionics, weapon systems, or flight dynamics. Nuclear arsenals pose particular dangers as military personnel lose understanding of safety protocols, maintenance procedures, and command structures. The United States nuclear arsenal of approximately 6,000 warheads, along with similar stockpiles in other nuclear nations, becomes a source of extreme risk as personnel charged with their maintenance and security can no longer comprehend the systems they oversee. International relations and diplomacy face complete breakdown as foreign service personnel lose understanding of cultural contexts, negotiation strategies, and geopolitical dynamics. Treaties, trade agreements, and alliance structures that have maintained global stability become meaningless documents to diplomats who can no longer comprehend their contents or implications. Environmental monitoring and protection systems collapse as scientists and regulators lose understanding of ecological principles, pollution measurement and conservation strategies. Climate monitoring stations collecting data on global temperature, atmospheric composition, and weather patterns become unmanned facilities generating incomprehensible information to meteorologists who can no longer interpret atmospheric science or predict weather patterns. The social fabric of communities begins to fray as people lose understanding of governance structures, civic responsibilities, and collective decision-making processes. Local governments find themselves unable to provide basic services as municipal workers lose comprehension of waste management systems, public utilities operation, and administrative procedures. The knowledge of how sewage treatment plants process human waste, how garbage collection routes are optimized, and how public works projects are planned and executed disappears from human consciousness. Religious and spiritual institutions face unique challenges as clergy lose understanding of theological concepts, scriptural interpretation, and pastoral care principles. While personal faith and spiritual connection may remain, the accumulated wisdom of religious traditions, ceremonial procedures, and community guidance disappears. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples continue to serve as gathering places, but their leaders can no longer provide the intellectual and spiritual guidance that these institutions have offered throughout human history. Cultural institutions including museums, theatres and concert halls find their collections and performances becoming meaningless displays to curators and artists who can no longer understand artistic techniques, historical contexts, or cultural significance. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, housing over 2 million works representing 5,000 years of human creativity, becomes a warehouse of beautiful but incomprehensible objects to staff who can no longer interpret their meaning or importance. Sports and recreational activities face disruption as coaches and athletes lose understanding of training methods, strategy and rules. Professional sports leagues generating billions in revenue find themselves unable to continue as players forget game rules, safety protocols and performance optimization techniques. The knowledge of how physical conditioning improves athletic performance, how teamwork strategies create competitive advantages, and how equipment design enhances safety vanishes overnight. Yet within this catastrophic scenario, certain fundamental human capabilities would likely persist and potentially serve as the foundation for rebuilding civilization. Basic tool use, pattern recognition, and problem-solving abilities that appear to be hardwired into human cognition might remain intact. Language skills, while stripped of technical vocabulary and complex concepts, could provide the means for communication and collaboration necessary for survival and eventual recovery. The timeline for civilization's recovery would depend heavily on which books, documents, and recorded information remain accessible and comprehensible. Libraries, databases, and archives containing human knowledge would become invaluable resources, but only if people could relearn reading skills and develop methods for understanding and applying the information they contain. The process of rediscovering basic scientific principles, mathematical concepts, and technical skills could take generations, but the accumulated written record of human achievement would provide a roadmap for rebuilding. Some knowledge might be recoverable through reverse engineering of existing technology and infrastructure. While people might not remember how internal combustion engines work, the physical engines themselves would still exist, and could potentially be studied and understood through careful observation and experimentation. This process would be slow and dangerous, particularly with complex systems like nuclear reactors or chemical plants, but it represents a potential pathway for knowledge recovery. The geographical distribution of surviving populations would significantly influence recovery patterns. Rural communities with access to agricultural land, water sources, and basic resources might fare better than urban populations dependent on complex supply chains and infrastructure systems. Island nations with manageable populations and contained ecosystems might serve as testing grounds for rebuilding sustainable communities. International cooperation would become crucial for recovery, but would be hampered by the collapse of communication systems and transportation networks. The knowledge of languages, diplomatic protocols, and cultural understanding necessary for effective international collaboration would need to be rebuilt along with technical capabilities. The psychological impact on human populations would be profound and lasting. The sudden loss of intellectual identity and professional competence would create unprecedented mental health challenges. People who define themselves through their expertise and knowledge would face existential crises as they struggle to understand their place in a world where their skills and understanding have vanished. However, basic human emotions, social bonds, and survival instincts would likely remain intact, providing the foundation for community formation and mutual support. The knowledge of love, friendship, cooperation, and altruism that forms the basis of human society might prove more resilient than technical expertise, offering hope for eventual recovery. Children and young adults might adapt more quickly to the new reality, as their brains retain greater plasticity for learning new skills and concepts. Educational systems would need to be completely rebuilt, starting with basic literacy and numeracy, and gradually progressing toward more complex knowledge domains. The process of rebuilding educational institutions and developing effective teaching methods would be crucial for long-term recovery. The economic implications of such a scenario extend far beyond immediate financial losses. Entire economic systems based on specialized knowledge, complex financial instruments, and global trade networks would collapse and require fundamental reconstruction. New economic models would need to emerge based on available resources, surviving populations, and restored capabilities. Agricultural recovery would be essential for preventing widespread starvation, but would require rediscovering farming techniques, seed selection, animal husbandry, and food preservation methods. The knowledge contained in agricultural extension services, farming manuals, and traditional practices would become invaluable resources for communities attempting to become self-sufficient in food production. Medical knowledge recovery would be critical for population survival, particularly for treating injuries, infections, and chronic conditions that would become life-threatening without proper care. The rediscovery of basic medical principles, pharmaceutical production, and surgical techniques would require years of careful study and experimentation, with significant human cost during the learning process. The environmental implications would be complex and potentially contradictory. While industrial pollution and environmental destruction might decrease dramatically due to the collapse of manufacturing and energy production, the inability to maintain environmental monitoring systems, waste treatment facilities, and conservation programs could create new environmental hazards. Nuclear facilities, chemical plants, and other industrial sites could become sources of long-term environmental contamination if not properly managed during the knowledge recovery period. The cleanup and safe decommissioning of such facilities would require rebuilding the technical expertise necessary to handle hazardous materials safely. Climate change mitigation efforts would be severely set back as the scientific understanding, technological capabilities, and international cooperation necessary for addressing global environmental challenges would need to be rebuilt from fundamental principles. The urgency of environmental issues would compete with immediate survival needs in resource allocation and priority setting. The scenario ultimately reveals the extraordinary fragility of modern civilization and its complete dependence on accumulated human knowledge and expertise. Every aspect of contemporary life, from the simplest daily activities to the most complex technological achievements, relies on the preservation and transmission of knowledge across generations. The sudden loss of this intellectual foundation would create challenges that dwarf any natural disaster or conflict in human history. Yet the scenario also highlights the remarkable resilience of basic human capabilities and the potential for recovery given sufficient time and resources. The written record of human achievement, the physical infrastructure of civilization, and the fundamental cognitive abilities that enabled the original development of knowledge would still exist as foundations for rebuilding. The path forward would require unprecedented cooperation, patience, and dedication as survivors work to rediscover and rebuild the intellectual achievements of their predecessors. The process would be measured in generations rather than years, but the essential humanity that created civilization originally would remain as the foundation for its eventual restoration. The question becomes not whether human civilization could recover from such a catastrophe, but what form that recovery would take, and what lessons might be learned about the true foundations of human knowledge and social organization.